Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to SETA DC. Today we have a panel on Russian foreign policy. It is mostly on a book on the new geopolitical realities for Russia, edited by Nurşin Güney and Vishna Korkmaz. And we will go over the increasing Russian assertiveness in foreign policy and the implications of this new Russian foreign policy to the foreign policy of United States, foreign policy of European Union, and of course its implications for Turkish-Russian relations as well. We have three excellent panelists, and Nurşin Güney, she is a professor at Bahçeşehir University in Cyprus campus, and she's a member of Turkey's Presidential Security and Foreign Policy Council. And Ellen Vasilina, she's the CEO of the Transatlantic Global Advisory. And Vishna Korkmaz, she is a professor at Yıldız Technical University. So without further introduction, I think I will pass the floor for Nurşin Güney. And Nurşin, just give us a little bit about your book and especially the division that you did in Russian foreign policy from 2008 until 2008, starting off the Russian assertiveness with the Russian invasion of Georgia, and then in 2014, Russian invasion of Ukraine. Tell us what did change in Russian foreign policy in the last 2 decades and why those changes took place.
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, many thanks for inviting us and for us to talk about the book that I edited. And I also, with this occasion, would like to thank to my colleagues and friends again that they gave a hand and we together made this book.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, okay. And so about your questions, as you see, the title is The New Geopolitical Realities for Russia. And from Black Sea to the Mediterranean, the title itself is quite explanatory what has happened in the last 2 decades or so, but mostly in the last decade, I guess. And by the time we decided to write this and edit myself this book, we were just watching the events that were unfolding one after another. And so what is interesting, yes, since 90s, we have seen that Russia was, after completing this period of uncertainty, it has started to gain some power, and it has become polishing its muscles. And then, due to the rise of oil prices and everything, we have seen that a new Russia was coming up. This one is said to be an assertive one, and also we have begun to see a rising, resurging Russia just nearby, around our neighborhood, both in Black Sea, as being Turkey, as well as very soon we were about to see a new neighbor in Mediterranean as well. And at that time, we have seen that in IR studies, people were trying to understand what this new Russia and what is its security and foreign policy is. And that is how, in theoretical explanations, people try to revisit the memories of geopolitics, this classical meaning of geopolitics. And then they were trying to match up words like mercantilism, heartland, Eurasianism at one hand, as well as they were trying to mention simultaneously by evaluating Russian behavior as assertiveness, resurgency, things like that. So this was the coincidence that was happening, and that is how, of course, IR academicians were trying to diagnose what is happening in the Russian foreign and security policy. According to some, it was a mercantilist movement that is happening by looking at, as you mentioned, right after the Colored Revolution, this 2008 Georgian intervention, which was followed in 2014 in Ukrainian intervention. and so on. They were thinking that Russian Cold War mercantilism was back, but they were wrong. In the contrary to this viewpoint, there is also Mehanist view supporters, and they thought by looking at Russia, trying to polish its Black Sea fleet and modernization, its navy, and the doctrines that they had issued in 2001, 2010, 2015, where there was a very assertive naval dialogue there, where they wanted to reach through Black Sea to Mediterranean and even beyond to the oceans and overseas. And they mentioned and underlined in those doctrines that they wanted to blue water capacity, which in the end they couldn't achieve this. But they said, since it was written in these documents, they said, okay, now we're seeing a Mehanist Russia conducting its foreign and security policy, and that is why they are in Syria after 2015. But they have missed something. This is what we have figured out. Actually, I was arguing with my colleague Vishna. I said, these people are wrong. I'm not a theoretician, but just a humble IR academician, professor, as you mentioned, located in Cyprus. I said to Vishna, this is a hybrid mechanism that Russia is going through. This was the definition of mine. And I had proofs at hand, of course. And we discussed with her, and this is how this book came about. And we decided that the behavior of Russia, especially in the field of foreign and security policy, needs a new theoretical context, and a geopolitical new redefinition is a must there. And that is how in the first chapter with my colleague Vishna Korkmaz, we said that Russia is hedging between mercantilism and mechanism. And this was not a choice of hers, but this was a necessity that she was doing. And also they tried after, as you're gonna be, if you have the chance of reading my colleague Alan's chapter, you would see that Russia has tried to become a mercantilist power and tried to, after the experience of Ukraine, it has shown that it has limits as being a land power in Europe, meaning conquering and controlling the area mass in Europe, or integrating into Europe. She has failed to do that, and she thought she needed to go down to Mediterranean and apply Mehanist policy there. But there too, even though she had limited capacity of A2AD military might, she had achieved a lot actually. We shouldn't, de-evaluate what they have achieved, but they have seen their limits, and so they decided that Mehanist policy is in fact a difficult and challenging job. It is an expensive one. You need to have a good economy, you need to have a blue water capacity, for instance, in terms of naval capacity. You need to have ships and aircrafts and things like that. You need to have a stable economy, as I said, and other things as well. And you need to go beyond the challenge of Montreux Convention, 1936, to go through from Black Sea to Mediterranean, to bring your navy very easily down to Mediterranean and things like that. And they figure out that they have to act in a hybrid way, meaning using every possible tools at their hand, including, for instance, trade, energy, and ring of friends. That is why I'm meaning hedging. And other than just ships, ports, and other military means, arms. So this is what I have come into a conclusion after arguing with my friend. And we said Russia is in position so as to fool these loopholes in Mehanist policy that it had launched right after Ukrainian crisis. So they have come to a point of having double failure, both in mercantilism and this time also in mechanism, in their strategies, in their sea power strategy this time, so as to not to fail more, they decided to bring up and somehow substitute the loopholes in their Mehanist strategy by, relying on A2 capacities there at their hand, and if possible to make it more strengthened, but also at the same time brings more substitutes, like bringing up new friends, as I said, in the energy field, which they have advantages and at the one hand disadvantages too. So Turkey and Iran has come into a fore in this picture in Russia to make progress in their hybrid mechanism, which is a limited mechanism that they are still pursuing in the Mediterranean region. And also, as I said, they try to benefit in every niches that West is making mistakes in the region as well. So that is how in 2015 onwards, what Russia is doing is this, and they re-evaluated their doctrines, naval doctrines as well, and they knew that they would not have this Mehanist dream operational anymore. That is why in the proclamation of Russian defense ministries proclamations, you would see that they were decided to bring up, modernize their navy, but instead of big aircrafts, they go for literization of vessels and frigates and things like that. So they knew their limits, but they make the most of it at the time being. But what I would say, the future is uncertain. This is another problem for them, ahead of them. So far, they did a good success. As I said, they are in Syria. They have 2 bases there. They made bubbles, and these bubbles that starts from Baltics down to the Mediterranean is a great success. But they know that they're overstretched and they have limitations, and that is why they are hedging between mechanism and mechanism, and instead they decided to go along with this limited mechanism, which I call hybrid one. And in this puzzle, of course, what will be very important for them, how they would manage to go along with the new ring of friends they have achieved so far, especially in this region. And I guess probably Vishnu will explain more, so I won't go further from this point. Turkey gains a great importance in the conduct of this new hybrid mechanism in this region. So this was the real idea behind of this book. So every one of us tried to focus on this new sea power of Russian conduct of foreign and security policy from Black Sea to Mediterranean, and each of us has tried to see and evaluate from its own perspective and the topic they focus on it, and they in the end, in the conclusion, come to a point where they can find if there is limitation or validity of this new Russian foreign policy that was conducted in Black Sea and also in the Mediterranean. And we had 6 chapters. And the first chapter was the theoretical diagnosis that we have made. Alan has worked on the Ukrainian case. And then we have also energy chapters that devoted 2 chapters for that. And the last chapter was about, again, this mutual interdependency, where Turkey has gained a lot of linkages that it has made towards to Russia that Vishnu will talk about. And this is all about it. I guess I can stop here, and perhaps you might have questions that I may like to answer. Thank you very much.
I will have questions as well.
Okay, then. Okay, then.
Ms. Vasilina, about the Ukrainian crisis, what really happened? And we know what happened in Ukrainian crisis, but how Ukrainian crisis changed Russian foreign policy? Did it influence in any different ways?
Sure.
Can we talk about a rupture in Russian foreign policy in the aftermath of the Ukrainian crisis?
Sure, thank you. And thank you, Nurşin. Thank you SETA for inviting me. I'm so pleased to be with my colleagues once again.
Okay, thank you.
It's lovely to be with you today. My chapter is basically about how, as you rightly point out, Nurşin and Vishne, this in-between Ukraine that is straddled on a European sea, which is the Black Sea. From the 90s, as you know, with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukraine found itself in a difficult position, and Russia also found itself in a difficult position. What to do as Bulgaria, Romania joined NATO, and then Georgia, which was leaning closer. And then to see Ukraine wanting to join NATO, join the EU, and also on the other side, and I go through two explanations from the external side and from the internal side of what was going on. On the outside, you had also a European Union integration fatigue after those 10 countries were integrated in 2004, which were all on the eastern border of Europe, and the difficulties that I won't have time to go into today of integrating those countries into the European Union, which gave some thought to Europe and to Russia on the other side of where Ukraine's place was in Europe. We talk about, of course, the recompositions and how Russia also created its parallel market system to help Ukraine integrate into some sort of system with other countries in the former Soviet Union. And the importance also of how the transatlantic community, the US and the Europeans, pushed the borders of Europe all the way up to the Russian frontier, the former Russian frontier. The desire for membership, but the difficulty for some of these Eastern European countries to step up and to become membership, and the lack of incitement, meaning there were the acquis communautaire, which means that they had rules and regulations to come into Europe, which some of the Eastern European countries found more difficult to adhere to or to simply achieve. And this was an opportunity also for Russia in dealing with its little brother, Ukraine, to keep a close relationship with Ukraine. Notably, Ukraine, as you know, produces much minerals that in the former Soviet Union, has the port that we know now in Crimea, Odessa, and the access to projection in the Black Sea and out into the Mediterranean. So these issues were not easy for Ukraine and Russia to get their heads around together, to be in step. And also from the European side, there was somewhat, I wrote in a piece one time, I said, who's going to fight for Ukraine before all these hostilities broke out? Ukraine is in a unique geographic position, has unique capacities, economic, defense, and should be considered to be one of the most important countries on the Black Sea. If you just look at, for example, I have a few figures here, if I could just take a minute to go through the size of the economies. For example, Turkey is 851 billion. Ukraine is 112 billion, Russia is 1.5 trillion, Germany 3.6 trillion. Now, if you look at the size of those economies and the size of the Russian economy, and Nurşin pointed out very justly, Russia must be able to keep up with its doctrines, its defense policies. As you know, Russia has been on the defensive ever since the dissolution of the Soviet Union and against Europe, even though there was a time when NATO wanted to integrate. Russia had a Russia committee, had a Ukraine committee. This was all back in the 90s. So we really haven't gone too much forward. And Nurşin points out a very important point, that they could no longer go over land and expand and get the Lebensraum that they need, because there's frozen conflict still in Moldova, there's frozen conflict still in Georgia, there's now the Donbass in Ukraine. So where are they going to go next? You have to ask yourself, and rightly so. So the expansion or the projection had to go out to sea. I might want to mention too that the revolutions played a very important role in how Ukraine, Georgia, and then later on, as I point out, in North Africa, proved to be an important clinching point, I would say, also for Russia, for Europe, to see where these countries would like to stand up to and become and decide for their self-determination. This was also a challenge to Moscow. Moscow did not want these type of demonstrations either. And how do they handle that economically and the trade between, and as many of you know, many Ukrainians and Russians have family ties. And so it's not easy and a black and white issue to say, okay, we're going to separate, we're going to step away, with so many historical years of relationships between. These revolutions, of course, fought some of the main challenges that are still present today, such as corruption, election fraud, bandit capitalism. The economy wasn't really working well. The model wasn't really working well. And I always say that the CIS failed in providing a better model, an economic and political and social model for some of these former Soviet Union countries. Then, of course, there's the issue of energy. There is no other supplier at this time, as you point out and some of our contributors point out, for European energy supplies. There isn't anyone that can supply the energy that Russia can supply. So Russia still has that capacity to supply Europe with a dependency ratio of, for example, 25% in all over Europe, and 100% as close as you come to the border, for example, in the Baltic states. So there's still, as you and I believe Vishne pointed out, some interdependencies in those countries between Russia, between Europe, between Turkey, which I won't develop. But these interdependencies, these dependencies on energy are really something to consider. Europe cannot go without Russian gas or oil. Yes, they get some from the south, from Libya and Algeria, but the major portion comes from the east now that they're rerouting Nord Stream. So Russia has managed to make inroads too on the energy for Europe, bringing this Nord Stream 2 onto line. There's a whole movement, as you know, and I was in Bulgaria, and that's where Nurşin and I were at a conference, remember?
Yeah,
where we were talking about the European Energy Union. Energy is big on the agenda and how to reduce dependencies for Europe on Russian energy, for example. This all came about following the Ukrainian crisis and how Russia can be a supplier, a stable, reliable supplier for Europe. Now, of course, there's a big movement, as you've probably seen, around also of reducing CO2. The COP 21, 15 that we've been seeing that is really pushing towards a reduction of dependency on fossil fuels. But then there's probably other suppliers. Can you think of some other suppliers, such as Azerbaijan or Iran? Are they?
Or USA.
Or USA, but geographically speaking, don't you think? It's much more practical with Nabucco, for example.
Cheaper.
Yeah, well, yeah, of course it's closer. So, and then I would say, let's think of who else can replace Russia in its policies and its dominance in the energy area. And finally, what about the sanctions? What about the containment of Russia? Nurşin said so well, you know, Russia is trying other policies to expand, to project now in with its blue water policies. Excluding Russia has not helped Europe. As many of you may not know, I spent most of my life in France. And I can tell you, Russia was not the only one hurt by the sanctions. France and all the European countries were also hurt by the sanction. Russians destroyed tons of cheese, French cheese, for example. Don't think that it was only Russia that was going to get hurt by the sanctions. All of our French cheese producers, you know, were being hurt by that. So I'm just saying these interdependencies, these linkages are on many levels with Russia. And I will stop there. I have so much more I could tell you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And Vishnu Hanım, on Turkish-Russian relations, which is one of the hot topics in this town, and provides us a perspective about the state of this relation.
Okay, thank you. When we together with Nurşin and Eda started to write this chapter, we had two questions in our mind. One is related to what Nurşin and also Alani mentioned, the shortcomings of Russia in following her very ambitious Mahanist dreams, we can say dreams actually, command and control of Mediterranean Sea. And we ask how Russia can compensate her shortcomings and how this compensation strategy actually creates impact over Turkish-Russian relations. This is the first question we asked. And the second question is related to nature of Russian-Turkish relations. As we know, Russian-Turkish relations has been usually described by referring asymmetrical interdependence, and asymmetrical interdependence usually as a model criticized by some scholars because the dependent party is assumed to be Turkey. The more dependent party is assumed to be Turkey because of Turkish increasing needs of energy coming from Russian imports, Russian imported gas. And we ask if it is so, how Turkey's bargaining power is increasing at the face of Russia, even in the very critical issues, and even in the security issues like Syria, in which both parties have not only similar but also diverging interests. And why we ask also, associated with this question, why Russia is still willing to get into bargaining with Turkey, while Turkish bargaining power is increasing. By asking these questions, we actually perceive that we need a new conceptual framework to understand real nature of Russian-Turkish relations. And that is why we try to find new tools. The first tool is provided by the theory itself, actually, for us, and it is related to how we evaluate asymmetrical interdependence or asymmetries in the interdependent relationship, because usually the scholars who look to the or observing, try to observe Russian-Turkish relations usually ignore the absolute gain and how Russia give importance to absolute gain when we compare the non-cooperation situation with Turkey, of course, and linkage strategies. Mutually advantageous linkage strategies which used very successfully by Ankara at the face of hybrid Mahanist offer of Russia. In this chapter, so we argued that the space associated with absolute gain in Russian-Turkish relations have been enlarged during the last couple of years because both sides choose to intensify and deepen their interdependent relationship existing between Moscow and Ankara already by initiating other cooperative deals in very, very sensitive issues areas or sensitive sectors like energy cooperation as Turk Stream, like S-400 years, defense cooperation, like joint patrols in Syria today, etc., and also like nuclear energy cooperation in Akkuyu nuclear power plant. In these linkage strategies, Ankara used her upper hand in Montreux Strait regimes and her key position as demand side in both Turk Stream, nuclear power plant project, and also S-400s to make the bilateral cooperation in security issues more attractive to Russia. And Moscow recognized these linkages as mutually advantageous one because of impact of certain geopolitical factors, which summarized by Nurşin very well at the first stage of our intellectual fighting as in hybrid mechanism. Russia wanted to and still wants to form a kind of ring of friends but these friends are capable friends. They have certain A to AD capabilities, both in political and diplomatic and military sense. And by this ring of friends strategy, this hybrid mechanism strategy, Russia wants to achieve some objectives. It is very wise strategy because by this way, Moscow explores opportunity of using her friends' influence to make certain areas free from their rivals' access. And so by doing this, she can use this friendship strategy as a kind of wedge strategy against her rivals. Former rivals like NATO, actually strengthened its posture in Mediterranean. We know that she returned by return of Russia to Mediterranean, she returned to Mediterranean because she left this area after the end of the Cold War. And also informal rivals. By saying informal rivals, I mean flexible alliances or let's say quasi-alliances or rapprochement, but these rapprochements or quasi-alliances or alignments has anti-Russian, anti-Iranian and anti-Turkey perspective or balancing objective. So Russia used this, hybrid mechanism strategy, this ring of friendship strategy as a wedge strategy to prevent the development of this access or this influence of these rival strategies. And by doing this, by preventing the influence of her rivals, Kremlin also, using this ring of friendship strategy, is refraining from direct confrontation with the USA. But also we should admit that Kremlin is lucky. And her chance is deriving from the fact that USA underestimated both Russian capabilities and importance of possible impact of hybrid mechanism strategies on the balance of power in the Mediterranean. And Kremlin's chance is deriving from the fact that USA was too ignorant to perceive that Turkey emerged as a key factor, key element in this hybrid mechanism strategy of Russia in both Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And Kremlin's chance is deriving from the fact that Russians have capable or have enough capacity to offer some important carrots to Turkey, while actually USA followed the strategy of deterrence based on punishment or punishment diplomacy or just sticks. So Turkey emerged, all in all, Turkey emerged as the key actor in Russian hybrid mechanism strategy because of numbers of reasons. I just want to mention some of them. First of all, cooperative regimes, foremost, East-West, North-South energy transit regime exists between two sides. And this regime or the cooperation with Turkey under famous Turkic stream gained importance in the eyes of Russia because Russians need a European store or should be open to Russian gas. There are rivals in the market and USA actually tries to sell its gas as politically correct gas. Expensive, shell-based LNG, expensive but politically correct. And we know that politically correct projects, politically correct commodities can find their consumers because of numbers of reasons. And Ankara needs a partner in her stopgap measures related to air defense system, and Russia needs a partner to keep her claim to be a good, reliable supplier in both energy and critical infrastructure technology, nuclear technology to possible consumers in the Mediterranean and Middle East area. Ankara has already started to develop her own A2AD capabilities, militarily and politically in its neighboring regions, and also not only on land but also on sea, and in the diplomatic processes like Astana, Sochi, Idlib, then again Sochi. Actually, Moscow recognized the importance of these capabilities in the field. Also, despite of being a member of NATO, Ankara has seemed to follow a more independent or divergent policy in the region because she needs still security assurances at the face of coming divergent threats from the south, and USA seem to be reluctant and too divided to recognize this need because of existing American strategy to support weak actors in the region, in the field. And Ankara has upper hand in controlling two checkpoints of three, Turkish Straits and Aegean Sea. She has naval supremacy there. And the third one is Suez. So she has an upper hand determining a balance of power in Eastern Mediterranean. Last but not least, Moscow perceived that the newly initiated anti-Turkey, and we can add anti-Iranian, axes or alignments in the region has also a potential to constrain Russian influence in the region in the future. So maybe the alliances can be seen or perceived or announced as anti-Turkey or anti-Turkish, has anti-Turkish character, but Moscow perceives them as anti-Russian also. Thus, all this brought to the conclusion that Turkey and Russia prefer to use mutually advantageous linkage to develop cooperation in various strategic sectors. In this chapter, we evaluated how this cooperation is developed in three sectors, as I mentioned before: Turk Stream, Akkuyu nuclear power plant, and S-400s. Of course, this project and the interdependencies here can bring their own costs and risks for both sides. But with the initiation of these strategically valuable projects for Russia, Ankara has strengthened its bargaining position in the existing bilateral mutual dependence between two capitals. So at the end of the chapter, we expected actually two things: turning off this asymmetrical relationship, asymmetrical interdependent relationship between Moscow and Ankara to a more symmetrical one, in which the sides have more equal say or voice to create a win-win situation. And we also expect reflection of this change from asymmetrical to more symmetrical interdependence in the more problematic areas of bilateral relations, including Syria. And this brings us to today's Syrian case. Yes, there are still many ambiguities in the field, and we don't know how the future brings new change and challenges for both sides. But after the two deals between Moscow and Ankara, between Washington, D.C. and Ankara, in the northern part of the Syria, Russia and Turkey they seem to emerge as winning parties of the northern Syrian game, at least in the time being. So this is because Moscow has very successfully followed hybrid Mahanist strategy in the face of Turkey, and Ankara has very successfully followed mutually advantageous linkage strategy at the face of Moscow, and this is because actually USA underestimated the potential of these strategies in the regional balance of power. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And before opening the floor for questions, I have a short question for Nurşin Hanım. Nobody mentioned President Putin in the presentations. Where is President Putin in this?
He's in the middle of it.
Yeah, he's in the middle of it. Tell me if we can dismantle this strategic outlook from President Putin, and where is President Putin here?
Well, he is in charge of the conduct of Russian foreign and security policy.
Can it be the same foreign policy if Boris Yeltsin or any other leader existed?
I don't think it will be changed because Russia, of course, the rhetoric might change, but Russia today, after the dissolution of Soviet Union, of course, there is a, they look for past, this glory past, being the superpower. Even though they are a great power at the moment, they are, part of the UN Security Council. It's one of the 5 nuclear weapon states. I mean, you name it. Okay, they are under sanctions. Their economy is very much dependent on the fluctuations of oil prices and so on. And we can add more, restrictions that Russian foreign and security policy can manage or cannot manage. But for instance, sanctions are not hurting Russian foreign and conduct policy, but which is very crucial is what will happen to the oil prices in terms of its effect on its economy. And that is how Russia can, flexible its conduct of foreign policy. Russia of today, starting with Putin days, I would say, it is very much aware of its limitations. But the way it talks, as if it used to be a great power or superpower like yesterday, is not a reality on the ground. But they assume and they observe very well the loopholes and the mistakes that is made by the American administration, not of even today. It started with Obama, as you know. That is how they came back where they left the Middle East in the Cold War years through the back door of Syria. And so what I'm saying is that they will try to, as I believe, and observing the realities on the ground related to Russia, they would continue this hybrid mechanism policy, even if, we'll have somebody else in the future, because there is a limitation what they can do.
Okay, so if Putin, Nurşin Hanım just mentioned that Putin, if there was another leader, the strategy would be more or less same. So do you think if there wasn't any association agreement between Ukraine or rumors of that agreement between Ukraine and Russia, would Russian foreign policy be the same towards Ukraine?
So
how the external factors influence Russian foreign policy?
So if Russia and, for example, even Ukraine had been accepted into the EU, had been accepted into NATO, things might look different. However, Nurşin points out something
But
that's
I'm asking
very
just
important.
Ukraine. So if Ukraine was accepted,
it's linked. It's
Yeah.
linked. You can't separate the two out actually, and you can see that both of them are out. And I think the fact that Ukraine and Russia did not want to join NATO, did not want to join the EU, did not want to join the EU Energy Union, tells you that yes, they are limited, But they are interested in keeping, as both of you had pointed out, their balance of power and their predominance in Europe, because they are Russia is a European power, geologically. If you look at the landmass, Eurasia is a geological, it's one piece. It's not separate. People that want to separate Russia out of Europe are mistaken. It won't be separate. So Russia is going to live out its dominance and its balance of power in that geological arena.
Okay. And if there wasn't any sudden thaw in relations between Turkey and sudden actually crisis between Turkey and Russia after the shootdown of the Russian jet, would you expect the same kind of sudden rapprochement between Turkey and Russia?
Yeah, it is a tricky question because I think this kind
I
of
like my question. I made it tricky. So.
because this, I think this kind of crisis make the costs and the vulnerabilities embedded in the interdependency obvious and visible. And at the face of these vulnerabilities and sensibilities, actors try to find new way of talking and negotiating and the new areas of cooperation. If they find, then they go away. If they don't find, then the crisis actually covers whole the rhetoric of their relationship. The crisis was the serious one down at the jet, but this was not the unexpected one. If we think the level of the crisis between Russia and NATO and Russia and the West, both in context of Ukrainian crisis in Europe and in Syria. So the crisis was so serious, but the answer, the reply of crisis coming from Russia was so moderate. If we think the real context of the sanctions on tomatoes or something, these tomato sanctions gave damage to tomato growing parties in Turkey, like the cheese makers in France. But Russia did not postpone, did not actually cancel or withdraw from the strategically important projects in Turkey, did not cut the gas, the transfer of gas, the selling of gas from north to south. So if we look to the moderate nature of sanctions and responses coming from side of Moscow, we understand that Russia did not want to escalate this crisis to the level to create non-cooperation situation between two parties. So I think I actually take the issues from more structural side maybe, and that is why I underline that this crisis, this type of crisis can happen or will happen in future because the regional balance of power is so fluctuating now. And there are many points, not only in Syria, but there are many points in the Mediterranean area or Near East actually in turmoil. But these kind of crises just bring cost on the table. But the sides, if they have intention to neglect these costs by creating new linkages, then they succeed to do so, and they succeeded after the 2015 crisis.
And in 7 months.
Okay.
Evet, within 7 months, yeah.
Thank you very much. And I want to open the floor for questions, if there are any. Gentleman over here.
Hello. Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. My name is Ali Demirdas. I have two questions. One of them is, Russia is a gas monopoly over Europe, and Moscow is so adamant about keeping this status. On the other hand, the regional actors in Eastern Mediterranean are trying to rush to bring this trillions of cubic meters of gas to Europe. What do you think Moscow is going to react to this endeavor? Do you think it's going to try to block this? If so, what are the options that Moscow would resort to block this transfer of gas from Eastern Mediterranean to Europe? My second question is, with the withdrawal of American troops in the Eastern Euphrates, Russia footprint is spread into much of Syria. Do you see this is going to pose a limitation for Russia in the future? I'm thinking, is Syria going to be second Afghanistan in the long run when it comes to this point? Thank you so much.
Go ahead.
For all of us, the question, okay. About the energy issue, I mean, I guess you were referring to EastMed project. Okay, and that is so debatable. I will not go into the details, but we know that it's not economically feasible project at the one hand. So that's technically can happen, but it's so expensive, and the Europeans are aware of this. But here we come to the geopolitics on top of geoeconomics, and so it's a political project, and everybody knows that if there is enough gas in, around Cyprus, we know that Israel wants to, transit some part of its in 2009 it was found, some of its gas to Europe via some way. At the beginning, it was through to Turkey and then to Europe. It was the shortest and cheapest way of delivering the gas. And there was not enough to fill this EastMed only with Israeli gas. And the Greek Cypriot ones that is found in 12 is not enough. If they come to take together and refill of course, the pipeline will be constructed. Then there is a chance that it could it will be transited to Europe. So this is the reality on the ground. But I would like to remind you the fate and history of Nabucco. It was a European project as well, and as everybody was writing and debating about how attractive project it is and how the Europeans also were behind it. All of a sudden, we have met with TANAP project. So I mean, we know that these pipelines may go here and there. But it is at the end of the way, it's the politics and geopolitics decision comes to the table.
But also, if I may, also a cost.
Yeah.
From our Azerbaijani colleagues. If there's not enough gas to go through and the cost isn't right, they won't construct. I have a whole issue on the Caspian Sea if you're interested. So if the cost isn't right, then there's not enough gas to go through and they won't construct it, and they deal in meters of pipeline. Okay, I had a special conference in Paris on that subject. So you're absolutely right. If there's not enough gas to fill it.
So the idea behind this gas issue about the Mediterranean was initiated during the Obama period, as you remember. And it was Obama by then thought that instead of dealing with other problems, problematic and hard security problems of the Middle East, it thought, if I cook this gas issue in the Mediterranean, perhaps I can facilitate some of the, not frozen, but, other deadlock problems. And it is an easy way of dealing. And it thought, with one bird, it could kill many birds, but it didn't happen. It stopped all these problems. And for instance, since Chris Montana, the negotiations between the two sides in Cyprus is deadlocked. And on top of many problems related to Cyprus issue. Now we have the gas issue, and it's a real problem how it's going to be solved, and it's also blocking the process. But about the Russians that you have mentioned, that's interesting. They are staying still, but they are in good position. We know that in Mediterranean, especially the bases that they had attained in the western part of Syria, we know that there are lots of gas reserves, quite big reserves in there. And so they made a 25 years old negotiation agreement with the Assad regime. So they are going to first, explore and use whenever they decided to that gas. But also, I'm so sure that they wouldn't like to have an alternative way of transmitting this whichever gas is there to Europe to bypass Russian dominancy in Europe. But I am sure they also know what is the reality on the ground, but they keep their silence at the moment. But of course, let's remember that they mentioned that right after Turkey has sent its deep drilling vessels, Yavuz and Fatih, to the west and to the east of Cyprus to work, they said, some authorities, oil companies, authorities said that if there is enough gas found there, we are there to cooperate with Turkey's side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, gentleman over there.
If you could state your name and affiliation. I'm Scott Morgan. I'm a freelance security analyst. I cover mostly African issues. One question I would like the panel to address actually is the power projection. For example, the efforts to assist the Central African Republic emerge from its civil war, the Russian presence in Sudan during the transition after the ouster of Bashir. I would like to hear the panelists comment about that as a new way of power projection, because there's some of the arguments that we're seeing is that Russia is actually doing this to present itself as a viable option to both the United States and China in Africa.
Who wants to address
I guess I'm not an African expert, but I guess you're mentioning about the recent Russian re-engagement with Africa, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was on the news, so that is a limited information that I have got. But yes, we know that China is there, US is there in African continent, and everybody has a bit surprised that Russians were coming to Africa. And that is the debate that was going on, but they were already there. I mean, this is not something new. How I can interpret is this, from my perspective, Russia is trying to give the image, even though it's limited, that it is a great power. It's now back in the Middle East. Foreign Affairs says that this was an anomaly, which is normally it's back. So in Africa too, it's a capacity, in economic capacity, what you can do there within this competition among the previous actors like China, for instance. But it is a matter of, image that you give. It's a great power, and now it's back to Africa. But we can be sure that the role can be limited, but we are living in a world of, images that counts at the end of the day.
If I may.
Yeah.
Oh, you had an
Please.
experience there, I know.
Yeah.
Sorry.
If I may, Russia is coming back. First of all, I mentioned the numbers. Russia is a $1 trillion economy. It's the size of Belgium. Okay.
Yeah.
Just for some
Spain,
perspective.
Maybe Spain also.
Yeah. So, just to keep the perspective on it, Nurşin's absolutely right. It's about power projections, but it's also about expertise and extractive, capacities. Many of these countries, as you know, and I have some experience in North Africa, are looking to another expert country in this domain to diversify or pump up some capacity. And Russia is, you must say, if you know what Russia does, Russia is an extractive power and has the expertise.
Yes.
However, they may not have the latest expertise, but they are very adaptable and supple and maybe less expensive than other companies, for example. So they can be a good competitor. Can they be a reliable, for example, supplier? These relationships are building up, as Nurşin rightly recommended and said, that on a geopolitical basis. Africa and some African countries are looking for another alternative to other powers, be it France, be it the US. So there's a diversification of actors. There's also, as Russia tries to enlarge in its footprint in the Middle East, it's getting some more echoes down through and in Africa.
I want to add something related to these issues. I am not expert of African studies or Russian foreign policy in Africa, but Russia can follow the same path that she followed in Mediterranean, in Africa also, by adapting a hybrid strategy. And maybe we should think what kind of couplings actually emerge from this, Russian rapprochement with some regional or close regional powers. I expect an interesting couplings also can emerge from this kind of hybrid strategy.
I also mention it, but will not mention it.
Thank you. We have 8 minutes left, so I will ask the last round of questions.
Okay.
If you can answer in a few minutes.
Okay.
This time we will start with Vishnu Hanım. And you mentioned the ring of friends that Russia is trying to create, and Turkey is a significant part of that plan. But how about the areas that Russia and Turkey disagree or not very friendly with?
Yes.
Right, including Ukraine, Georgia, Nagorno-Karabakh, and even like Black Sea region, even now Eastern Mediterranean. How they can reconcile those differences when Russia is trying to create that ring of friends strategy?
Okay, maybe they choose till now. They choose to use compartmentalization together with this. Together with this mutual advantages linkage strategy. Actually, on theoretical level or on paper, we expect that these two strategies are not so good couples because they imply different kind of behavior for the actors. But till today, Russia and Turkey successfully follow these two strategies together just because they intended to cooperate. They want to cooperate on the issues they can cooperate. This creates bargaining power for both sides at the face of rivals. They know that, and by this rationality they act. Since the competition between Russia and US continue in the Eastern Mediterranean and in Mediterranean and on Europe, we will expect the same path in the future. But of course, there can be certain crises, some serious, some non-serious crises. But this path, I expect, create a clear path for these two capitals till the US decide to go with how she go with Turkey and Moscow on European and Middle Eastern security.
Okay. Compartmentalization was one of the sexiest words in this town to explain the divergence of interest between Turkey and US for the next 5-6 years. It's not working that well, so I hope your optimism works with Russia. And in regards to Ukrainian crisis, what did Ukrainian crisis taught Russian foreign policy? What did Russia learn from this crisis?
Good question.
I asked good question, I told you.
I agree. What did it teach Russia? Well, in terms of its former republics, that the rise or the liberation or the evolution towards market economies, and so there's two parts, actually. The acceptance or the rejection of, from, for example, Ukraine to Europe, wanting to go home to Europe, for example, and then the rejection of that. In other words, some of these Soviet republics were not well prepared, did not have the capacity to, first of all, as you know, they all need to join NATO first before they join the EU. So there's a military side to this. Some of them were not prepared, were not well trained, could not integrate. And finally, I would say that some of them were able to, but I think there is a strong linkage, and we talk about linkage and compartmentalization. There's also the balance of power, and Ukraine is particularly important to Russia, less so probably than some of the other smaller republics. The reason I mentioned the GDP of the countries, it's important to know that Ukraine is the biggest economy. It is the breadbasket of Russia. It was the, the rocket capital. It has the minerals. It has a lot of things that Russia needs to continue to project its own power. I find it difficult that Russia would let Ukraine go in any way, given the destabilization of this mineral east in the Donbass. And just because letting Ukraine go, to my mind, no longer gives Russia that outlet, of course, that it now has with Crimea to the Black Sea, and all the aspects of its beginnings. There's a historical, it's very difficult to say it in such a short period of time, but this historical seat, if you will, that's so symbolic for many Russians that still keeps it, and I think Russia will stay linked to Ukraine for a long time.
Thank you. And Nurşin Hanım, you mentioned the hybrid mechanism, and that's the set strategy for Russia. And Mike Tyson has this very famous quote saying that everybody has a plan until they got punched in their nose. So what would be the moment that Russia would think that this strategy is not working?
Well,
What would be the game changer?
game changer would be power shifts in the region. But
In what sense?
in what sense? They are in the Mediterranean at the moment, but I don't think they would like to go beyond Mediterranean, meaning to the overseas. They would definitely not do that. But being back in the Middle East via backdoor of Syria, with the call of Assad regime, they will try to hold on to what they have gained so far and try to balance the rivalries, and especially the West and the US and others, the allies. But I mean, I know what you mean. They are already overstretched. So that is why I'm saying that they will go along with this hybrid mechanism. Not to go with sea. They had already gained the bases and everything. They retreat some of their troops, as you know, from Syria. And so with these alignments, issue-based alignments, Astana, Sochi, whatever, they will try to hold on. I don't think that they shouldn't be making the mistakes the Americans has made.
Okay.
I should underline this, meaning they should not rely on non-state actors like PYD, because these instruments seems to be practical use instruments on the ground. But we have the experience of Americans in Afghanistan, for instance.
Yeah.
So
Russia has its experience in Afghanistan.
Russia, that's what I mean. So
Yeah.
they should remember their experiences, and so as not to this mechanism and mechanism dreams of theirs already failed. So they had already experienced double failure, and this time this is the new opportunity ahead of them. And
Okay.
Turkey stands there as the great balancer, and it could be the absolute gain for the Russians if they think wise enough.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the panel, and thank you very much for coming.
you.
And please join me thanking for our panelists.